Welcome back to Global Money Talk, live from the New York Stock Exchange. I'm joined by Danielle DiMartino Booth, CEO and Chief Strategist at QI Research. Danielle, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here. I'm so excited to have a nice, in-depth conversation at the New York Stock Exchange. This will be a first for me.
Oh, and I have so many questions. I'd love to get your insights, watch a lot of your talks and your videos. So, I'd like to start. Actually, we've got this huge payrolls number on Friday, and it really turned the market on its head. The bond market slaughtered, the stock market actually rather liked it, and when half the market, or more than half the market, were thinking about 50 basis points, now some are even talking about should they have cut it all.
Right. There's definitely been a marked shift in the mindset, and this has really been a global non-farm payrolls report. We've seen ripples throughout the world. For one example, the British bond market moved even more than that of the United States. There was clearly a lot of positioning for a one-sided report. So when we saw that great big 254,000 headline, a lot of people had to completely reverse where they were and ask themselves more than anything else, was I thinking about the U.S. economy in the wrong way? But there are a lot of details in the report that suggest that Chair Powell and others on the Federal Open Market Committee on the September the 18th meeting were actually thinking the right way about that larger than expected initial rate cut that was predicated on weakness in consumption. Weakness in consumption as reported by all 12 Federal Reserve districts across the United States, which was a highly unusual thing to see headed into the FOMC, and that's why Chair Powell mentioned the Beige Book. And the reason I bring up that detail is because once you started digging beneath the headline, you did indeed see that a lot of the jobs that have been created, in fact have been created for all of 2024, are some of the lowest paying jobs. And that helps to explain some of the stress that we're seeing in the consumer sector despite splashy big headlines in terms of job creation.
You just opine really quickly. The revisions were a little bit of a surprise. We saw revisions higher for the last 2 months for the first time in many months. Is that significant, or is there a story behind that?
Well, there's always a story. There's always a story behind every number, and that's kind of our focus at QI Research. Is we're always trying to dig beneath the headlines. And in fact, in July of 2023, we had a similar kind of rippling in the market, because instead of the string of constant negative revisions, we saw a positive revision in July of 2023. What was behind that revision was that more than all of the revisions were attributable to government jobs created. That's exactly what we saw in August of 2024. So in July of 2023, we actually had a negative revision to private sector payrolls. Identical setup in August of 2024. More than all of the positive revisions in August were attributable to the government sector. And we actually saw, again, negative private sector revisions. So sometimes it really helps to pay attention to the details, because it's telling you that when we have a situation like PepsiCo coming out of the gate early on in this earnings season and saying, we're still seeing a very selective, choosy consumer who's having to be very price conscious, that's because the private sector continues to shed jobs.
Well, that changes the complexion certainly a little bit. And I wanted to ask, because the market, as long as I've been in the market, focuses on this payroll number to almost the exclusion of everything else. Not the exclusion, but really it's the number of all numbers, and you said international as well. And I guess that may be a little unfair, but do you have a favorite indicator, or the indicator that you always look at, for that it might be a little, or maybe one or two of them that tells you something about the economy that most people who just watch the news won't see?
So there are two main elements of the non-farm payroll report that we pay the closest attention to. The first, which I'm going to go to second, is the types of jobs being created. But we have a mantra at QI Research: hours before bodies. Hours before bodies. When you see a 34.2-hour work week, you stop in your tracks and you say, wait a minute, those are hours being cut before actual layoffs, before actual bodies being cut out of the workforce of any given employer. And again, to see a 34.2, there's a 14-year low that we saw in this last payroll report. That's extraordinary. And the idea of labor hoarding, because it was so difficult after the pandemic came and then the economy reopened, and these were very much technical factors that affected the ability to rehire the best workers. And of course, you want those best workers. So you're seeing a reluctance among companies to reduce their headcount. But what they're doing instead, as demand slows, as household bankruptcies rise, as corporate bankruptcies rise, what we're seeing instead of headcount reduction as an initial step, because it was so difficult to acquire those employees after the economy reopened, is hours being cut. So we said, wow, 14-year low in the work week, next step, headcount reduction.
That's great, because nobody ever talked about that. It's sort of like a throwaway line, oh, an hour's work. I've never actually heard in 30 years in the market, even an economist, talk about hours worked in an interesting way. So at 34.2 is a little low. Where would you like to see that suggests a more healthy economy?
Well, I think at 34.4, 34.5,
okay.
Those, and it may sound like a very small movement, but when it comes to what makes the U.S. economy hum, what makes the driver of the U.S. economy is aggregate income.
Right.
It's the number of hours worked times the number of individuals working. So when you're talking about a 34.2-hour work week, the aggregate income destroyed, and that's how you have to look at this, is tremendous.
Interesting.
And that actually can equate to a certain number of jobs that were actually cut when hours are cut enough across the entire massive U.S. workforce. So that's the first thing that we look at very, very closely.
Have you ever seen that at 35 or 36? Does it ever get up that high?
Absolutely. When you had companies unable to hire sufficient numbers of workers, they were working their workers harder. It's the old-fashioned overtime.
Right.
Overtime refers to a really elongated, higher work week. And that's because you don't have enough employees on hand, so you're asking the employees who you do have working for you to work longer, work more hours in order to be able to satisfy the demand. That's why one of the other things, if I can digress for 2 seconds, that we follow closely are backlogs. We're looking for backlogs, whether it's a law firm in services backlog. Again, boy, I've got requests to do work that I simply don't have the manpower, the woman power to complete. So my backlogs are growing. That's an indication of future demand for labor.
And do we
Same
see
with
that
the
in the
manufacturing
employment report as well?
We had seen backlogs that were very positive. Now we've seen a string of weak backlogs in services and in the manufacturing sector, both, that we haven't seen in a long time. That's why it was such a big surprise to a lot of people on Wall Street to see the fact that we had this strong non-farm payroll headline, but at the same time, whether you're talking about the ISM non-manufacturing, the ISM manufacturing, S&P Global Manufacturing, S&P Global Services, all four of those employment indices in reports that preceded non-farm payrolls showed contracting employment indexes.
Right,
and that's a reflection of negative backlogs. The fact that you actually have more workers on hand than you need because your backlogs have turned negative. So we've seen a real flip in that dynamic. And that goes to the second element that we follow so closely in the non-farm payroll report, and that is the types of jobs created. In the month of September and August and July and June and May and April and March and February and January.
Like a pattern.
Like a pattern. What I used to tell when my children were younger, do you detect a pattern? we've seen 50% or more of the jobs created be in education and healthcare. So I ask you, I'll be Socratic for a moment.
Sure.
Does it matter what's happening in the economy, or do you still need to go to the doctor, and do your children still go to school?
Right, right.
So we call education and healthcare recession-proof industries. They're going to continue to grow their payrolls regardless of what's happening at PepsiCo and people not buying Tostitos because they're going down and substituting for a store brand. So those recession-proof industries, the fact that they're creating and have been for all of 2024 more than 50% of the jobs is not a sign of strength.
They're both education and healthcare are really, really important, but it's not really economic growth.
Exactly.
They're not really engines of economic growth.
They're not.
At least not immediately.
No, and that's why we have to study so closely the makeup of the jobs. And in fact, when you look at prior recessions, you actually see private payrolls begin to turn negative in the face of continued growth in education and healthcare, because we're always going to get sick. And I think we discussed before coming on it, we both have 4 children, so we're always going to send our children to school.
That's absolutely right.
But that's why we call them recession-proof.
So we should actually have, non-farm forget non-farm payrolls ex education and healthcare. Let's have that. Let's look at that number. That'd be maybe a better number to look at.
It is, and there was a time, for example, in the high yield credit market, that we got so used to saying X energy. Well, you say to yourself, if you net everything out, then what are you really even looking at? You're simply making economic data convenient to fit your own narrative. That's simply not the case when it comes to education and healthcare jobs, because they genuinely are basic needs. These are industries that are going to have job creation regardless of what economic output is in the aggregate, which is gross domestic product defined.
Right. That's really, really good insight. I want to switch gears a little bit because I know our viewers want to hear, and this is a really tough one, in a very, very closely divided electorate and election. What does it mean for the economy and or markets between, if Vice President Harris wins versus where, if former President Trump wins? Like, where are we going to see, if you were an investor, where are you looking at? What should you be thinking about?
So, it's interesting. We just had fresh data out from the National Federation of Independent Business, and their uncertainty index rose to the highest level on record because the outcome of this election is so economically, vitally important to this economy. We forget that in a post-pandemic world, there were emergency unemployment benefits that applied to gig workers and the self-employed. There was a rental eviction moratorium for 19 months nationwide that paid for your rent, which is your largest line item as a household. But what I'm describing is fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is critically important. Is there going to be spending in the defense sector? Is there going to be more support for overseas wars? Is there going to be more funneled into U.S. industry? Is there going to be more onshoring? What are the initiatives? How are tariffs going to affect the economy? What type of social spending is going to occur? What kind of funding is FEMA going to have? Gee, that's on everybody's mind these days. But it all comes down to the makeup of fiscal policy. And that is why there is such hyper-focus on the fact that the polls, in most cases right now, are so evenly divided. We really are going into Election Day with a complete unknown as to the outcome. I will tell you, though, that there is a very high degree of certainty, judging from what the punditry says. There is a high degree of certainty that the U.S. Senate is going to flip back into the hands of the GOP, into the hands of the Republicans. And that's when you get back to Civics 101, U.S. History 101, and the very idea of checks and balances. In December of 2020, to give you but one example, then President Trump was asking of Congress for a second stimulus check in the amount of $2,000. At the time, there was a Republican-led Senate that capped that second stimulus check at $600. So it was much less additive to the deficit at the time. It was much less additive to consumer spending at the time, because instead of getting $2,000 directly deposited into your checking account, you only got $600 that you could pump directly into the economy. And that is where the outcome, I think, of the congressional elections in the United States is so much more critical to the fiscal policy that we're going to be looking at least for the 2 years that follow the election into the midterm elections. Sure. And that is indeed what politics in America has become. We've become a 2-year election cycle country, and it's just a fact of life.
It's almost for the House at least. Maybe it's too often. Every 2 years, you're legislating for a year and you're spending a year on your re-election. But to your point, but I've seen, I guess, the Republicans can snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory better than anybody. I think we've seen the 2022 red wave became barely a red ripple. So let's say, counterfactually, that Vice President Harris wins, and she gets a 50-50 in the Senate, which means Tim Walz would cast a tie-breaking vote, and the Democrats take the House, which seems to be sort of
that seems to be your base case right now. Is that the Democrats take the House? So that is correct, and so you could paint a scenario where there was a blue wave, and boy, the implications are tremendous.
So where do you see for the markets and for the economy?
Some very good economists at AEI, for example, they've done very simple back-of-the-envelope math on what it would be like to give 4 million U.S. first-time home buyers a $25,000 credit to buy a home. So it would cost taxpayers somewhere in the neighborhood of about $100 billion. It would add to home prices by about $175 billion. I think 92% of economists, which means it's a bipartisan agreement in the economics community, say that would be a very bad thing for U.S. housing policy, because it would actually make home prices increase more than the benefit that would be provided to home buyers. And that's just one example. You think about the idea of helping to pay for education, or more student loan relief, or something along the lines of a universal basic income, a modern monetary theory. There are a lot of social spending programs where you would open the pathway to being very much more giving as an electorate, more socialist leaning in terms of how fiscal policy is shaped in the event of a blue wave from an investor's perspective. What we would say, and I'm going to use shorthand here, is short every U.S. Treasury if that's the case. Because if you think that you've seen fiscal spending gone wild with more of a balanced backdrop in Washington, D.C., just you wait until, and by the way, wait until either party had control of the White House and both houses of Congress, and therefore a blank check, carte blanche, the ability to have whatever kind of spending in whatever form that they wanted for it to be.
Right.
So that is not the base case on Wall Street right now. I think that there would be a lot more alarm if that was the case. And in fact, most of the people I speak to, because if you look at deficit spending under President Trump and you look at deficit spending under President Biden, they're pretty close to one another.
Yeah.
So I think that it is much more a matter of whether or not the Senate flips back to being Republican to stop overspending by either potential occupant of the White House. I think that most investors are agnostic in purely a dollars and cents sense. I think that they're somewhat agnostic to who wins the White House and much more focused on whether that check and balance is going to be in place after Election Day with a red Senate.
It's great insight. I think that's absolutely true, and I think Americans don't take their civics, seriously enough. And as you say, in terms of the social spending, if there's a blue wave, if you rob Peter to pay Paul, you're pretty much guaranteed the support of Paul.
Yes.
And that's, I think, the base of a lot of politics.
So. I lived in the country of Venezuela, which is something I rarely talk about, but I did. I lived in Venezuela for a very long summer, and it was prior to Chavez coming to power. There was a massive income inequality divide at the time, in much the same way that there is in the United States right now, and therefore there was a groundswell of support for major fiscal spending programs But you come to find out more than a decade later, somebody's got to pay for it.
Look what it has wrought to Venezuela. So it sounds like maybe if we get the divided government, whoever is the president, we can maybe just stick our money in the S&P 500 and sort of let it ride. Whereas maybe we'll buy home builders if there's a blue wave. Maybe. I want to shift a little bit because you were earlier in your career. You were with the Fed a long time. I think you might have some special insights on the Fed. I'm not asking for any proprietary or embarrassing information, but really, your thoughts on. First question is: does Jay Powell ever worry that if he lets inflation take hold and go maybe a second time, that he's going to be Arthur Burns #2? We remember Arthur Burns only, the 1970s Fed chair, only because he let inflation really get out of control. Does that ever intrude into Powell's mind, like, for this job, I don't want to remember badly, half a century from now?
Well, he certainly has been very vocal in saying, Paul Volcker is my hero. Two speeches ago at Jackson Hole, in fact, he mentioned Paul Volcker multiple times. And so you certainly see that he does not want for his legacy to be anything like that of Arthur Burns, because his hero is Paul Volcker. And Paul Volcker broke the back of inflation, famously.
Right.
So, but when you actually plot out Jay Powell's higher for longer campaign, and you compare that on a very simple time continuum with that of Paul Volcker, Jay Powell was higher for longer at a higher level and for longer than Paul Volcker was.
Wow. Didn't realize that.
And we don't appreciate how very long he held the line, even when there were signs that the labor market was weakening. So I think what concerns me more, because I'm hawkish in nature. Mm-hmm. What concerns me more is that there are very few people who are like-minded to Jay Powell, and we don't appreciate how soon May of 2026 is going to arrive. Right. It really is just around the corner, when he is no longer going to be. I don't think he would take a third term, and I don't know that he would have support to be offered a third term. So under the assumption that May of 2026 is indeed when his term ends and when he steps down, one of my concerns is that when Vice President Harris was the swing voter in the Senate, there were quite a few progressives who were confirmed by the Senate, Lisa Cook being one of them, with the swing vote of Kamala Harris to become confirmed to the Federal Reserve Board. And so one of my longer running concerns is that elements such as climate change or a central bank digital currency, which frightens a lot of individuals. They look at it as being a mechanism by which the government can track your spending and see your spending, which is kind of very un-American, if you will. But there are a lot of progressives with long terms who are on the Federal Reserve Board who could be instrumental in shifting the U.S. economy to being much more progressive in nature through the mechanism of monetary policy making.
That's really interesting. I want to get back to some of the new governors, because there's a kind of cypress to me. But before I forget, where do you think the neutral rate is now, give or take? And which way is it going?
Well, I think it's very hard to pinpoint the neutral rate. I think that where most who contribute to the dot plots want for it to be has been inching down. It was 3.1% 2 dot plots ago. Now I believe it's 2.9%. What I will say about the neutral rate is I want for them to be right. I do not want to go back to zero interest rate policy. I think it was failed. I think that it ignited the wrong kind of speculation, and I think that it made price discovery that much more difficult for rational investors who want to consider risk and return, as opposed to just, I'll take, risk doesn't matter because the Fed's going to have my back in a zero interest rate environment, or there'll always be quantitative easing coming to the rescue, and ergo, neutral's irrelevant. I want for the dot plot to be correct in the long term. The terminal rate, I want to be something with a 2 in front of it, and not to go back down to 0. And I'm very, very adamant about that.
Any concerns that sort of the green economy and going low carbon that will elevate the neutral rate because those things just cost more and are less efficient? At least they seem to be for now. Is that going to elevate the neutral rate over time if we want to use less efficient ways of doing things?
It certainly could. And in fact, there was a parallel discussion going on at the beginning of the pandemic when there weren't enough masks in the United States, for example. And so there was this big discussion. Do we accept higher inflation in the long run in order to onshore critical industries that are matters of national security? And you're asking a parallel question to that. And I'd like to think that capitalism itself finds the most efficient way to price and produce. And if that's the case, we hopefully don't buy into a higher neutral rate long term. But again, there are definitely exceptions, and the patriot in me is not in any way, shape, or form disappointed to see an effort towards bringing more manufacturing back to U.S. shores, and or simply building a tighter supply chain with Canada and Mexico, which actually makes economic sense when you factor in something like, freight, which we talk about quite often, and supply chain disruptions and what can happen if there's a strike at the port. Whereas if you've got a tighter supply chain that's closer to home, it might end up raising what that inflation is ultimately, but to maybe an extent that we're all willing to accept in order to have a more secure supply chain going forward.
I think that's the right question. And very quickly, where do you think I remember learning about NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. What do you think that ought to be? Where's the unemployment figure, that makes you happy and sleep well at night?
So I think we're learning in real time right now. I think that kind of the 4% area is where we're in safe ground. What we've seen once we've gotten past that 4% is the appearance of very low initial jobless claims. But we also have more part-time employment in the United States than we did at the peak of the Great Recession. So we have completely refilled our part-time job pool with just a very small movement up in the unemployment rate. And again, we're an aggregate income GDP economy. And if you're working multiple part-time jobs in order to make the same income that you did when you had one full-time job, that's not the sign of a balanced labor market.
Very, very good point. And before we run out of time, I do really want to hear about, you mentioned Lisa Cook, Philip Jefferson, Adriana Kugler. I've been following the Fed for a long time. It's part of a misspent youth. I didn't do anything fun with it. Who are these folks?
We're in a very small club.
Who are these folks? Michelle Bowman is the hawk, right?
Michelle Bowman is clearly the hawk. Talk about somebody we didn't hear from very often. Now we hear from her every other day.
But who are Phil Jefferson and Adriana Kugler? I have no idea.
So, if you're looking at a spectrum, it's interesting. Kugler's dissertation advisor was Janet Yellen's husband.
Oh.
At Berkeley.
Wow. I did not know that.
And so Kugler and Cook have both advocated for some of the most progressive monetary policy making in the history of at least American monetary policy making. It's much more resonant of what you might hear at the European Central Bank, for example. Philip Jefferson, his name has been bandied about as being a potential future chair, because he is seen as being somebody who is in the middle and balanced in his approach and balanced in his views, very articulate, soft-spoken. The irony here is, of course, that when I was leaving the Fed and I was following Richard Fisher, the president of the Dallas Fed, when I worked for him, the irony here is that he asked me at the time in 2015 to pay close attention to one of his close friends by the name of Jerome Powell. And I said at the time, well, it's hard to pay attention to somebody who barely talks and is so quiet. And I would point out that there's that similarity between Jefferson of today and Jay Powell of 2015. So he might be one we want to pay close attention to.
Well, I wish I could talk to you for, I think, hours, but unfortunately, we're just about out of time. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope at some stage when we get you back on the show again.
I would certainly enjoy that.
Thank you so much for all the insights.
Thank you for having me.